So next up, we will now shift to Ukraine. So we'll have Sergiy Kudelia, who will be speaking generally on extrajudicial violence in Donbas and its consequences for Ukraine.
Thank you. Good morning. So I've been relatively new to PONARS, been here for 5 years, but I've been a very grateful consumer of PONARS memos, so I'm very glad to be part of the celebration this year. Throughout Ukraine's history, there have been oftentimes incidents where we see political violence that is used by government agents outside of the legal framework. These incidents have been random, and they have been usually followed by the government cover-up. This memo is about a different type of violence. It's about the violence that has been routinized, that has become part of the counterinsurgency strategy, and that has been justified by the Ukrainian authorities on the national security grounds. What kind of evidence do we have for that violence? So first of all, there's plenty of evidence that you can find in open sources, like the court verdicts that convict individuals accused of terrorism or participation in illegal armed groups. In my memo, I tell a short story about a person who was captured in a small town in Donetsk Oblast near Mariupol by 3 military servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces. He was taken to a secret detention site where he was tortured, demanded information about separatists living in these towns, and then after prolonged torture, he was left dying in the neighboring village. The 3 servicemen were promptly detained, but they were later on released on bail, and not only they received conditional, very light sentences, but they also were awarded government medals from the Ukrainian government a year after they committed this murder. There is also some evidence that we received from interviews that had been conducted by the NGO Amnesty International and by the Ukrainian public television, Громадське телебачення, but these are quite rare interviews with the victims of these enforced disappearances and torture. The most extensive type of evidence that we received is based on the reports of the Office for High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, the reports that have been published since spring of 2014. And I'm going to give you just 3 quotes from these reports. Well, first of all, what the UN established is that not only the SBU is running the secret detention sites in Donbas, but it actually is running these detention sites all over Ukraine, in all major cities, and these secret detention sites are located in the basements of the SBU buildings. We also learned from these reports that while these individuals are detained illegally incommunicado for a prolonged period of time, months, sometimes years, they also are subjected to torture, and the torture ranges from beatings to waterboarding to suffocation and other types of torture, with the goal of either extracting information or punishing them for their alleged relationship to separatist organizations. What we also learned from the United Nations report is that in most cases, the Ukrainian government refuses to acknowledge the responsibility for this violence. And actually, I talked about cover-up initially, they refuse to acknowledge that there is violence in the first place. And as the UN report makes clear, oftentimes there is a lack of investigation, particularly when victims that were detained on the national security grounds or viewed as pro-federalist. This, in the view, and this is from the latest report that was released a couple of days ago, signals to the perpetrators of these crimes that they are basically immune for the responsibility for human rights violations. A broader graph from the VDEM Physical Violence Index, which measures the extent of physical violence, physical integrity violations by government agents, shows that the period that we're living through in Ukraine right now is unique, that we've never seen such a high level of intensity of violence on the part of the government against Ukrainian citizens. What are the causes of it? If you look at the cross-country studies of government repression, you would see that there are a lot of variables that are clearly present in the case of Ukraine. I will outline three specifically. One is civil war. Civil wars are highly correlated with the increase in the government repression. And of course, the fact that most of this violence is targeting people who are living in Donetsk or in Luhansk Oblast shows that there is a clear connection to the armed conflict in Donbas. The second variable is the presence of paramilitaries. And as UN reports make clear, initially most of the perpetrators of these acts have been members of the paramilitary groups. But what's interesting is that basically since 2016, Security Service of Ukraine became the key perpetrator of violence. So paramilitaries were sidelined. Instead, you have SBU, who is now the chief perpetrator of these crimes. The third variable that is correlated with high level of repression is hybrid regime. Hybrid regime in the sense that you have very weak institutions that allow these kinds of repressions to take place. What's interesting about Ukraine's case is that not only that the problem is not only in the weak institutions, but also those institutions that are quite effective in dealing with other types of violations, for example, corruption violations. These institutions are ineffective, are purposefully ignoring the incidents of extrajudicial violence in Ukraine. I'm talking specifically about the media that almost never reports on the instances of this, these kinds of human rights abuses, and civil society groups, specifically human rights organizations that are usually, most of the Ukrainian human rights organizations are focused on the violations of human rights in Crimea, in Russia, but they're not talking about the human rights violations committed by the SBU in Donbas. There is also a disinterest on the part of the parliament. In fact, members of the parliament, rather than questioning the actions of the SBU, they're actively participating in the court proceedings in order to pressure the judges to let the perpetrators of some of the crimes that were brought to justice let go. This in particular deals with the trials of the members of the parliamentary groups. Finally, there is also having no criticism of these practices by the Western leaders. We don't hear the issue of human rights violations raised publicly either by the European Union leaders or by the United States. And it's not something that is happening only now under the current administration. The same pattern has been happening under Obama administration as well. We see instances of, we see references to human rights violations in the State Department reports, but we don't see this issue addressed publicly by high-level officials. Finally, why it matters. Why is it important? And I would argue there are three major reasons why I think this is very important beyond the devastation that this kind of practices brings to the lives of human beings living in Donbas. First, it clearly shows that the Security Service of Ukraine has acquired an unusually broad discretionary power and acquired something close to an institutional autonomy within the government structure, which would allow the SBU to retarget some of its repressive practices to domestic political opponents if they think that the current political regime led by Petro Poroshenko is not going to survive. And of course, as I made clear in my memo, Hritsag, the head of the SBU, is a close loyalist of Petro Poroshenko, and they certainly have a mutually dependent relationship because the security service, apart from being implicated in these major human rights violations, which some may argue amount to crimes against humanity, are also involved in major corruption that is actually being reported by the Ukrainian media. Second reason why it matters is because, as we know from the literature on civil wars, Barbara Walters writes about it, the main condition for any peace deal in the armed conflict is the guarantee of immunity and safety to people who are involved with the rebel groups. So specifically immunity and safety to tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of Ukrainians that are now participating in governance structures of these two separatist republics and in paramilitary groups of these separate republics. But the track record of the current government, the failure of the government to condemn and investigate these crimes, and actually the authorization of these human rights violations against people in Donbas, all of that shows that any promises that the Ukrainian government would give are devoid of any credibility, that it's not going to be a credible promise even if they give it. And finally, why it matters is, of course, in order to achieve a successful reintegration of the territories that are even now under control, you need to give to the local residents a sense that they have the same rights as are other citizens of Ukraine. But by pursuing these kinds of violations, you're basically telling them that they're stripped of many of their civic rights. People in Donbas, under government control, are stripped of many of their civic rights that other members of the Ukrainian society have. So of course it fuels resentment towards the government and prevents successful reintegration of the parts of Donbas that are now under government control. All right. Henry tells me I have to stop, so thank you very much.